questions again with me being on camera, but because we've now got two cameras,
Yeah. No,
I think we can run this thing straight through, so I hope.
No, that makes much more sense.
Yeah, well,
It doesn't mean that you can't have it do over, ask a question again, or answer something different.
Sure.
Just remember to pause before saying, and then we'll say you can go ahead and do it again, and just pause before you start.
okay.
Look at each other and pause before you start. Okay, so I'm gonna. Yes, please. So I'm gonna do a poor person's clapboard right here, just so we can synchronize the different filming sources. And Chris, okay, whenever you are ready, you can just, have a look at Joe, and then wait a few seconds, and then go ahead and start with the, I think you're going to do your introduction to what this is, and go into your first question, right?
Yes. Okay. All right, you ready for this?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. We're down at our research centre at Point of View as part of our Parents of the Field project. And we're talking with our friend and colleague Joe Monteville, who is long associated with ESCAR and when it was ICAR. And we're going to ask him about his part in the development of the field of conflict and peace studies. So Joe, welcome to Point of View. It's kind of you to come and talk to us about your long experience. And we hope we're going to have a good hour's interview.
Well, it's an honor to be selected for this program, and I love Point of View, and I think it's a very important project. I'm 81, and I'll be dying sometime. But it's important to get the older members. So I'm really pleased to do it and really honored.
Good, thank you. All right, then, let's start with a really straightforward question about you, which is how did you become involved in this field in the first place? What attracted you to it? What was your background when you came in?
It's odd in a way because I was determined to get into the Foreign Service. I had been an international relations major at Lehigh University with Kerry Joint, who was a Canadian who had a lot of connections with the British academic peace crowd. Then I went to Harvard to study area studies. One didn't stay in international relations at the time. You picked a region and then specialized in it. And I applied to Yale, and that was a Southeast Asia program. All of them required intensive hard language study. And I think I spilled some ink on my Princeton application, so that never went. But the one to Harvard for the Center for Middle Eastern Studies came out clean. And I was particularly attracted to the Middle East because the hard language was Arabic, which has an extensive community, and also Islam. And ultimately, if you get admitted to Harvard, you should just go. And my first year was financed by my paternal grandfather, and so I went. And then the next year, I got a National Defense Foreign Language Fellowship, and then I bought some clothes and hi-fi, and I was off to the races. From there, I got a Fulbright to Cairo, and I loved being in the region. and met my first wife there. And and she was very instrumental in me getting into the field. Actually, the Foreign Service context in the Middle East was mostly instrumental because it was a conflict zone all the time. But I also was very naive about the Foreign Service and the whole idea of diplomacy as peacemaking. And my first assignment to Baghdad was to Baghdad, Iraq, because of my Arabic. And in about a year, I started off with a rotational assignment to consular, commercial, economic sections, administrative sections. But I moonlighted in the political section because that was my biggest interest. And I had a real epiphany, in a sense, during the Vietnam War. The State Department sent a confidential telegram, an ALDOC, that is all diplomat and consular posts, that said, that flatly denied that the U.S. was bombing North Vietnam. And the next day, the New York Times published a major expose by Harrison Salisbury, who was in North Vietnam, Pyongyang, and had witnessed the bombing of canals around Pyongyang. In other words, there was, it's kind of like today, and constant revelations of new documented lies, but the fact was that the government was lying to all diplomatic and consular posts about bombing North Vietnam when we were bombing North Vietnam. So the old saying that a diplomat is someone sent abroad by his country or her country to lie for the country was pretty standard, but I was kind of shocked. It was a revelation. But the period I was assigned to Baghdad, it was a year and a half, 65, 67, was sort of a golden age. It had the first civilian prime minister, Abdurrahman al-Bazaz, and all of the Baghdad elite was delighted. They formed a club called the Baghdad Society, which was really a piece of land not too far from the Tigris, where you could have barbecues and meetings. But it was a good period. But it ended for all of us in diplomacy and the West dramatically. By that time, I had been sent to Basra, the consulate, for 6 months to fill out my original assignment. And it was on the 5th of June, 1967, a day that will live in my infamy, when the Israelis took out the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. War had been threatening. Abdel Nasser had been making more and more serious threats to the Israelis, and the Israelis were preparing to respond. And our little consulate did have an iron sort of grating fence, and I'd put a single padlock to hold it, but somehow when the mob came down the Corniche in Basra, the whole student body of Basra University seemed to be coming down to Corniche, and they did push over our fence and went into 2 of our 3 homes or apartments. It's a small compound, lovely, but and they and the families of those 2 compounds were in the Chancery office where I was. My wife was in the 3rd apartment, but it looked like the backside of one that they'd already sacked, so they didn't try to go into that. And our servant locked her in the bathroom and himself in the food closet, and they both prayed. I felt that I could not go out into the mob to rescue her because I would probably have been incited them. But they went down, smashed the cars, and then left. And she came in to the chancery, and we were all reunited. Then this is a funny side of the story. On the 5th of June, 1967, which was rather short of fun, but in diplomatic and consular posts where there's any classified information in your safes, your filing cabinets, and there's an emergency, and it's quite common to burn the files. It happens all the time. We had a big barrel and sodium nitrate, I think it was, and I burned the files. I didn't realize that our next door neighbors were actually the Kuwaiti consulate, and when they saw a 20-foot shoot of flame going above in our backyard, they didn't know we were burning papers, and they called the Basra Fire Department, and the Basra Fire Department came, which is kind of sweet, very old trucks and old firemen who came on. By that time, the Iraqi army had been deployed and to guard us from further attacks. And my first significant negotiation in diplomacy was between the Iraqi army major, who was commander of the troops guarding us, and the Basra Fire Department that wanted to put out the fire. And I had to explain to them that it's customary in diplomacy that when you're having a riot, to burn all your secret, your classified documents. And I explained, and I profusely thanked the fire department for coming to rescue us. The major was totally indifferent to their courage, but there was a very successful parting of the two sides, and the potential conflict between fire department and the army. And then we packed up in a few days. Relations were broken, and we went to Khorramshahr. That's when Iran was our Iran, and the Shah was our Shah. And my wife was, I should have mentioned this earlier, she was in her 9th month of pregnancy. And we went to Abadan, which is next to Khorramshahr, a great oil center. And we found an OBGYN, and he gave her a letter saying that she was 6 months pregnant, so she could fly home to New York from Tehran. She had to fly up to Tehran and then New York. And it worked. We had a kitty and an Abyssinian cat, and she carried that in the cat carrier. And our daughter was born 36 hours after she landed at Kennedy Airport. And that was a big success. It was certainly a success for the airline, not having to assist at the birth of a baby. So you tend to remember the upside of things.
So a dramatic entry into the world of diplomacy.
Yeah.
So how did you move from the world of diplomacy into the world of conflict analysis and resolution?
Well, I had 23 years in the diplomatic service. The bulk of that was in the Department of State, the Near East Bureau, Bureau of Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs, and then I was made Near East Division Chief in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. And so I was dealing with conflict all the time. But then my first wife had a psychoanalysis. There'd been a lot of stress, and she's even recently, actually in a phone call to congratulate me on my 80th birthday, she did refer to that attack on our consulate in Basra in 1967. So she was in much more greater danger than I was. So anyway, I wrote a good letter that got her, I think it's about 2.5 years of psychoanalysis, which is impossible now. Insurance won't pay for it, but and the state won't either. But she had a very important and effective psychoanalysis, and as she was going through that, she would explain to me what she's learning, what she's talking about, what the analyst is extracting from her childhood, and her relationship with her parents. And at the same time, and as I might have mentioned to you, our next door neighbor was a psychoanalyst, also David Joseph, MD, and he explained the whole process of what we're going through. And I just got very, as I tell people, I came to understand what was happening to my wife and to our marriage. But I came to understand Iraqi politics because issues of identity and wounded identity and memory of humiliation and loss and uncompleted mourning of losses, which is what tribes and nations experience unless there's an unusual reconciliation. I guess the ideal one would be the Franco-German reconciliation after World War II. Where some very gifted people, Germans and French, worked on engaging and dialogue and community exchanges, students and merchants, twin cities and so on. They really worked hard. Jean Monnet was the genius in establishing the European coal and steel community, which eventually morphed into the common market. But anyway, I was fascinated, and I took a course at the Foreign Service Institute. Professor Norman Itzkowitz, who was a very close friend and colleague of Dr. Vamek Volkan, who was my closest partner in a psychodynamic approach towards conflict analysis and design of conflict resolution interventions, gave a 2-week course at the Foreign Service Institute on psychology and foreign affairs. And friends of mine told me about it. And I took it. And I want to stop at this point. One of the most outstanding parts of my Foreign Service career and in the diplomatic career was the consistent support of all of my supervisors for all of the unconventional work I did. Unofficial diplomacy, studying psychology and foreign policy. And then I was told that down in the Watergate Hotel, which was just a short walk down from Foggy Bottom from the State Department, there's something called the Institute for Psychiatry and Foreign Affairs. And I went down there and introduced myself to Dr. William Davidson, who was a psychiatrist, and had gotten some money to actually integrate the study of diplomacy and psychiatry. And I have to at this point note that one of the biggest impetus for political psychology in conflict analysis, as far as the psychological field was concerned, was the speech that President Anwar Sadat gave to the Knesset in, 1977?
9?
No, I think the Camp
That's
David
right,
Agreement.
2 years before.
77, yeah.
2 years before Camp David.
Sadat was amazing in his speech, where he was very firm on defending the Arab cause, the Palestinian cause, but in a speech to the Knesset, he did say something critically important from the psychodynamic point of view. We accept you in our midst, and this was in the Knesset. This is the soul of the establishment of the new Jewish state. But from our perspective, mine and the psychiatrists, psychologists, is that 70% of our problems are psychological. It was like the gong in the firehouse. The psychiatrists, psychologists got all excited and started organizing themselves to help facilitate communication, dialogue. They sent, the American Psychiatric Association sent teams, 2 or 3 psychiatrists, and these were all, the psychoanalysts were all MDs, so they were all physicians as well. And they would go to recruit Egyptians and Israelis, their counterparts, psychiatrists, psychologists, and tell them that they'd like to. We're going to raise funding. They're going to raise funds for dialogue sessions to support trust building in the Egyptian-Israeli relationship on the basis of the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. They understood as professionals that these are very fragile agreements. And we established, so Bill Davidson and I, Davidson got an invitation to produce an article for Foreign Policy, the quarterly. And I wrote it, but he was my senior, so I put him down as the first author. And it introduced the concept of Track 2 diplomacy into the literature.
Okay. Yeah. Was it called Track 2 at that point?
No, I called it Track 2. I'd actually coined the term at a meeting at Esalen Institute in 1980 because of being recruited in my office in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research by a representative of Esalen Institute, because Esalen Institute had started its own citizen diplomacy initiative with trips to the Soviet Union. It was a period of great despair at the time. The Carter administration, after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, after there was a slaughter of Afghan aid workers, the Moscow Olympics were coming up. The Carter administration vetoed the Moscow Olympics.
So yes,
formed
the US withdrew, if I remember right.
Yes, it withdrew. It formed what I called affectionately the Committee to Kill the Moscow Olympics in the State Department. And there are a lot of ICBMs aimed at us, and we aimed at them. And one of the most discouraging parts of the cutting off of connections with the Soviets was the cultural exchanges. There was a feeling. There was a novel at the time, a fear of flying. Erica Jong, and we adapted that title called "To Fear of Frying" to characterize what concerned citizens were thinking about and worrying about, given the state at the official Track 1 level. Anyway, at this meeting that I was recruited to come to, we were all asked, why did we come? And I said that I suppose that you could say that what I do is Track 1 diplomacy, and what you're doing is Track 2 diplomacy. It's not as though the angel Gabriel had come and whispered it into my ear, but it just seemed like something that made sense.
Okay.
And it was just adopted. And there's a bizarre, I have an interpretation, the fact that I had a top secret code word clearance that came from the Bureau of Intelligence and Research as an active duty intelligence officer. I was foreign service, but my field in state was intelligence. That some of the people who were worried about having a desire to do something about this relationship where that was so filled with the threat of nuclear war. And having somebody from the State Department who, totally without authorization, had simply said, track 2 in citizen diplomacy is a good thing, they took that as a sign that the State Department was supporting their initiative, which is fine. They don't realize the State Department could never take a position like that. It couldn't get it cleared through other bureaucracies.
So where does, in all of this, where does the ISPP fit in, the International Society of Political Psychology? Because we're talking late 70s, early 80s.
Yes, right. Well, members of the the Committee on Psychiatry and Foreign Affairs of the American Psychiatric Association, they appointed me as a consultant, an unpaid consultant, but they and I got the approval of my supervisors to be an unpaid consultant, and so it was my connection with them that got the invitation to go to Esalen to work on the U.S.-Soviet relationship, and I was already immersed or beginning to be immersed in the psychodynamics of conflict analysis and conflict resolution. Issues of identity, of self-respect, ego psychology, how if you bomb people a lot really hurts their feelings. So that's how I got involved in and members of the APA committee were also joining the ISPP, International Society of Political Psychology. And so I went along for that, and I became a founding member of ISPP. In fact, I met you at an ISPP meeting at Oxford.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
It was a very exciting society because it was totally unorthodox. Gene Knudsen, the founder, had a PhD in clinical psychology and a PhD in international relations, but was very unconventional. And so we were able to, I for instance, recruited Stanley Hoffman up at Harvard to become our candidate for president. And he was against it. He had no interest in it. But I'd been working with him on track 2 stuff on Israel-Palestine up at Harvard. And he wouldn't have to do anything for 3 years, and he didn't have 3 years in his book. He had no excuse for refusing, so he accepted it. James McGregor Burns became a president. I think David Reisman was not a president, but he won a prize for professional contribution, psychology, political psychology. Vamek Volkan, we had 2 MD psychoanalysts made president. All of that is impossible today because it's completely controlled by social scientists who don't do depth psychology. You couldn't get a psychoanalyst into the room now. It's one of the sad things. It's the structure of the culture of academics requires that you have a mathematical approach towards data gathering and data analysis, and 5 authors on every journal article. So I've stopped reading the journal, but I bring my copies to the library at Escar because somebody should collect them.
So that seems to me to be one of the things that you can say about a lot of beginnings of the field, that all sorts of inputs came into it from a wide variety of backgrounds, and some of them took and some of them didn't.
Yeah.
So how did you eventually You mentioned that you were originally working on the Soviet-US relationships from a background of the Middle East.
Yeah.
But then your ideas about depth psychology, identity, etc., very much seem to fit into the Middle East. So how did you get back to that in a way?
I never left it. I actually handled both sides. The thing about depth psychology and getting some sense on the consistency in human needs, especially identity needs, is that they apply to humans everywhere. I had the honor, at the invitation of Michael Murphy, who was the co-founder of Esalen Institute and the leader of the Esalen US-Soviet exchange program, to do a seminar on the psychology of the US-Soviet relationship. And I was smart enough to know that a totally unknown mid-level Foreign Service officer would not be the person to attract the kind of people I wanted to bring for a week at Esalen, a spa with their wives, paid for. So I said, I want Erik Erikson to be the attraction, because I loved his work. And it turned out that the Murphys, Michael Murphy and Dulcie Murphy, were friends of the Eriksons who lived up in Marin County. And they gave me the telephone number. And I called Erik, and I was nervous, very nervous calling. It was like I called him, "Is Jesus at home?" It turned out he was a total pussycat. He was very approachable and very concerned about the state of the US-Soviet relationship, and willing to participate. And he rejected the idea that he would be the centerpiece, so I didn't push it. I just made sure that everybody knew that he was the centerpiece. And we got some very good, superb Sovietologists, Jerry Huff, Severin Bieler, Jim Burns, James McGregor Burns. So I was mixing the two. See, once you have the analytical tools of depth psychology, you can do what Erik Erikson did in his first collection of Childhood and Society. He was working with Indian tribes and how they reacted to being repressed and treated with contempt by European settlers. After a while, abuse and injustice really affect the emotions of people, of tribes and nations. I was once gave a talk in Shannon, Ireland, because I worked on Northern Ireland too. And it just came to me again, The Iron Laws of Human Nature, which is a very presumptuous title, but that's what seemed appropriate to me, that every individual, tribe, and nation craves recognition, acceptance, and respect. And if they're denied that, the basis is laid for conflict and potential violence. But there's a little story I tell about sitting in my dentist's chair, and he's complaining about Muslim violence, and he said there's just something in the Quran. And I did something quite reckless, which I've done every once in a while in my career, especially if somebody has tools that could cause me a great deal of pain. But I said, but we bomb them a lot and it hurts their feelings. And I told this little anecdote to a well-known scholar from Boston University. I'm blanking on his name. But he laughed hysterically, and he lost his son in the Iraq War. But he was also very anti-war. But anyway, what I'm focusing on, and in fact, my big project this year at Point of View is on the Civil War at 150 years, deep wounds yet to heal. I'm turning this whole toolkit that I've been working on in the Middle East and Northern Ireland and even Ecuador and Peru and India, Pakistan, on ourselves. And it seemed to me an appropriate thing to do, since we have twisted ourselves into an unrecognizable mess politically and in our governance. And it's time to look very, very seriously at how unhealed wounds in our own tragedy, 750,000 deaths, have affected our difficulty in governing ourselves. No, there's a lot more to it than that. There's a lot of corruption in terms of big money, dark money, buying people, buying whole Congresses. But I thought that this was a very basic place to start. So it all works from my perspective. Now, I don't dominate the field, hardly. But I have some support. The Carnegie Corporation has been very supportive. I spent about 10 years at the Center for Strategic and International Studies after retirement from the Foreign Service in 1988. And I had a very sympathetic executive vice president, Doug Johnston, who was very interested in religion and diplomacy. And he ultimately left CSIS to form his own institute for ICRD, for conflict resolution. Let's see, ICRD and Institute for Religion and Diplomacy. And even there, one of my projects was funded by Carnegie Corporation. And it resulted in a book. I haven't done a single monograph, but I've done 3 collections. And this one's called History as Prelude, Muslims and Jews in the Medieval Mediterranean. Because I had discovered that Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, was a place of incredible symbiosis, to use a term that Jewish historians had been using to describe the interaction of Jews and Muslims in Spain. In fact, the Jews who were already in Spain when the Muslims crossed over from Morocco, they became advanced scouts to tell them where the Christian Christian forces were, and so they became actually allies in the conquest of Spain, which is kind of cute. Anyway,
you've mentioned a number of names that fortunately I'm familiar with, but looking back, who else do you think was a major influence on the way that you thought, the way you approached the whole issue? There's a sort of gap in my mind between the founding, the parents, the founding fathers that we've interviewed, and some of the names that you mentioned. Was there anybody in sort of mainstream peace and conflict studies that had an influence on you, or were most of your influences taken from depth psychology, psychoanalysis, analysis, etc., etc.? Who else?
I knew Bryant Wedge.
Yeah.
And the NGO that was supporting the establishment of the U.S. Institute of Peace. But Wedge was also a physician.
Yeah, he was a psychiatrist.
But he was your physician.
Yes, he was our psychoanalyst.
Yeah. And actually, it's a great tragedy for the whole field of psychiatry and psychotherapy that has become a subdivision of the pharmaceutical society, country. But I worked with, Vamek Volkan, of course, was one of my closest colleagues from the American Psychiatric Committee.
How did you come across Vamek?
Well, he was a member of that committee. And he actually came to be the chair of the committee. And he established his own research center
Down in Charlotte.
down in Charlottesville at the University of Virginia, and I became a faculty member there on resident. And we got some good grants from the Pew Charitable Trust, actually. He got a grant to study the Baltic countries and their relationship with the Russian minorities. And I got a grant to work in Slovakia, also in the relationship of the Hungarian minority. You see, once you get into people's heads, it doesn't matter what language they speak. Their emotions and their needs are identical in terms of respect and feeling secure. At the time, Steve Del Rosso, who was the senior international security fellow or staffer at the Carnegie Corporation, was on the staff of the Pew Charitable Trust. And he had a pile of money he needed to give away. And when I called him, he was in his office and he said, I'm just sitting here looking out the window wondering what I could do with this money. Yeah. We just started a conversation. It happened that he was actually working on a PhD on relationship in Eastern Europe with the transition. So after Vamek and I, we did very creative work and did great reporting to the Pew Charitable Trust, but Pew finally decided to get out of the foreign affairs field anyway. But Steve then transferred. He was hired by Vartan Gregorian, the new president of the Carnegie Corporation. And Steve has been a strong advocate of track 2 diplomacy. In fact, at his initiative, Carnegie commissioned a special cover story at their lead magazine, the Carnegie Report, that's published twice a year, on track 2 diplomacy. And so Steve has always been interested, and Steve has been a strong supporter of ESCAR, ICAR and then ESCAR. And so has Vartan Gregorian. In fact, the Carnegie Corporation itself has taken initiatives to establish meetings, dialogue sessions with North Korean diplomats assigned to the UN in New York with unofficial specialists in Korean affairs. So they love it. But they're fairly conservative in terms of focusing on well-established academics with final degrees. But Gregorian is very interesting. He was born in Azerbaijan. He's an Armenian Iranian. And he's been very, very interested in creating an environment among the American intellectual intelligentsia to make Islam safe for them and for American intellectuals and culture. Anyways, Steve was a major factor in supporting me and supporting that book on medieval Spain. And then in my current Civil War project, because they seem to trust me.
Well, and you seem to be very good at picking things which are important and relevant and timely as well.
Yeah, I do tend to be drawn to life and death situations.
Yes. Not thinking about life and death situations, but Hal Saunders?
Well, Hal, I recruited Hal. Not that he needed much recruitment, but he was, after he was basically expelled. He was a career civil servant.
Yeah.
He'd been a CIA analyst, and because of his gifts were discovered very early, he was recruited to staff the National Security Council staff, which is staffed from other agencies in the national security field, and then brought in to be head of the Bureau of Intelligence Research, and ultimately Henry Kissinger, I think, made him Assistant Secretary of State for the Near East and South Asia. Mm. And so I worked for him directly when he was made Assistant Secretary for the Near East and South Asia. I was the director, the chief of the Near East Division of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Mm. So I covered all the Arab countries plus Israel.
Right, yeah.
So I worked for him directly. Mm. And then when Reagan was elected, his transition team came and basically threw him out.
Well, by that time he'd been to Camp David with Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
He'd been
and
with Kissinger to the sort of Sadat-Israel situation.
No, he's central to that. I mean, he was a hero.
Yeah. And he'd written The Other Walls, the book that he because that always
I think that came out of his experience. Because frankly, he was too busy trying to help get the Camp David agreement through, and then he's critical in Carter's representative in dealing with the Algerian government, which was the mediator between us and the Iranians to free the hostages. Yeah. But the Iranians had apparently made a deal with the Reagan transition team also, not to free the hostages until inauguration day for Reagan.
I've heard rumors about that as well, but it never seemed to get into the history books yet.
Yeah, it hasn't yet, but it will sooner or later.
Yeah. So, sorry, going back to what you said about how you said you recruited him for the field.
Well, I loved him. I had enormous respect for him, and everybody who worked for him had enormous respect for him. And since I was already doing this unconventional stuff while still on active duty, I went after him and said, listen, I got him invited to participate in some of the workshops that the American Psychiatric Committee was arranging. We had 2 in Switzerland, one in Austria, one in Egypt that I missed because I was having a baby, and then 2 in the States, one at Y Plantation, and the first one was at the Watergate Hotel. Mm-hmm. And
these were all Middle East focused?
These were all, they started with Egypt and Israel, and then in the third session, we added Palestinians. Okay. And so he was very important. He was also very active in VAMIC's, it's the Center for the Study of Mind and Human Interaction at University of Virginia Medical School. And he and Carol actually came to a number of the meetings that VAMIC organized in Lithuania, which was very interesting for me since I'm Lithuanian on my father's side. But also in Latvia and Estonia. So
he was covering all of the Baltics.
Yeah. Once you have a sense of human needs and the hunger for recognition, acceptance, and respect, there's almost nothing you can't begin discussing in terms of problem solving. But you just start with winning trust, or if you can convey a sense of respect for the needs, especially if you convey some knowledge of the kind of history that they've suffered, including a willingness to acknowledge many of the sins that the U.S. has committed. I recently read in a chapter of Don Shriver, who was the president of the Union Theological Seminary, and he won a prize for his his book. Anyway, it was a chapter he was writing, and there were two things that I didn't know, that on a visit to Mexico City, President Carter went to, I think it was Chapultepec, where there was a memorial to 6 Mexican soldiers or students who were killed fighting the American army in the 19th century when we were grabbing something. And Carter just wanted to go and pay them respect. A very, very important factor in conflict resolution, in gestures. Shriver learned that, and I didn't know how he learned it, because I doubt that he interviewed the Mexican taxi driver or driver that was driving Carter, but the driver himself said he was overwhelmed that the American president would come and honor 6 people who were killed by the American army in the 19th century. That's one of the key elements of our work. And just as a side note, I was in St. Petersburg with an Esalen project in September of this year. And I went out, I tried to get our group, we had students, Russian students who spoke English, and American students who spoke Russian, and they were wonderful, and the Russians were outstanding. Left me very optimistic about the future of Russia. But I couldn't organize our group to go to there's a special cemetery where the victims of the siege of Leningrad are buried outside the city. But I had promised a colleague who teaches at the Middlebury Institute at Monterey in California, Russian, and she's a member of our group, of the Esalen group, and I had suggested at a meeting in April that we make a mission, we make a pilgrimage to this cemetery and honor the dead. And I couldn't get it on the program, but I went out myself with a driver who was very sensitive, and who said his grandmother had also been in the siege and she survived, but she refused to talk about it. Anyway, the flower of choice is a red carnation, and my driver went across the street and bought a bouquet for me. And you walk down a long center walkway that ends up facing a big statue of Mother Russia. And there are plots all along the road with the number of the year where people were died in the siege. And there was a whole berm of red carnations laid out in front of the statue of Mother Russia, and that's where I put my bouquet. I saw my Russian colleague who teaches, Anna Vasilyeva, and I wanted to bring her one red carnation, but I couldn't buy just one red carnation. Safeway didn't have just a single carnation, so I brought a bouquet for her. At the meeting I just went to in Big Sur. But it's tremendously important, acknowledging the losses. You know, you just can't talk about, well, the Russians are being insidious and sneaky and so on. Because anybody who knows how Track 1 is carried out, everyone has intelligence activities. The CIA had a whole organization, a student organization that it sponsored in the 60s and 70s. That's what states do. That's what Track 1 is. Boys being nasty, or boys being wicked. And that's what has, I think, certainly contributed to the steady acceptance of the concept of citizen diplomacy, where official government just can't handle it. The behavior patterns of men acting like tough men, neocons, needs to be compensated for. And that's what I recognized when I was in the State Department. And that's what started me, but it's growing now more and more. And I have a book that I'll be bringing around. It's called Track to Diplomacy, written by a Canadian named Peter Jones, who was commissioned by George P. Shultz, who was former Secretary of State when I was in the State Department. Shultz became enamored with Track to Diplomacy after he left the State Department. And he wrote a very fascinating, for me, forward, because my work is, and my discoveries and my assumptions are described by Peter Jones in the book. There have been several books on Track to Diplomacy, but occasionally they'll mention the source of the term, but not much of what I was doing. And I love this because it's much more attentive to what I was doing and thinking. And Shultz confessed that when he was Secretary of State, he used to hear about Track to Diplomacy and consider it to be kind of a pain because, like most people in charge, they were fearful that amateurs were going to screw things up, are going to send messages to adversaries that will confuse them. In other words, men would like to be in control. And then he, I won't say confesses, but he admits in his foreword to the book that he came to realize that Track to Diplomacy is an asset for Track 1 diplomacy. And if it's done carefully and professionally, should be valued by those who can't make or test ideas or walk in the woods the way unofficials can, but he recognized that it really is value, and he commissioned the book. So that was a big triumph.
So, I mean, was there a point in your life when you left the official world and became thoroughly embroiled in Track 2? Because I remember, I think, when I first knew you, when I came over here, you were still working for the Foreign Service Institute. And was that the tail end of your official career, and then did you become fully involved as a...
Yeah, well, I never stopped being involved in Track 2 while I was still fully employed in intelligence and research in the Near East Bureau. But what I did was, I had been in charge of the Diplomat in Residence program, and I continued to do that in retirement because it was valued by the Human Affairs Bureau. But then I was picked up by Doug Johnston and the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and he gave me an office. And then I raised some money from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation to support me. Actually, I raised a lot of money, which you have to do in this field. You have to find the small number of foundations who are willing to support you, and then you just hustle. It's seduction all the time. Actually, but it helps to be at CSIS, which has a reputation of being more part of the military-industrial complex. It's more than that, but it still depends pretty strongly on the industry, the defenses, and very conservative foundations. But Doug wanted to do a project on religion and diplomacy. And I was very interested in that subject. So that was a natural thing, a connection. So in a way, it was setting the conceptual basis for approaching conflicts. The book, for instance, History as Prelude, Muslims and Jews in the Medieval Mediterranean, is not just an academic exercise. It was meant, and I gave copies of it to two members of the Knesset on a visit 3 years ago. and I have passed it out. It's to let some people who are interested in trying to deal with this headache of how you deal with the Palestinians. They keep having more and more babies. In fact, they are probably from the river to the sea, the majority population. And you have people like Netanyahu, who was trained by his father to really to find it impossible to trust Arabs and Muslims. It's just impossible. They are the Graham that want to kill us, period. And it really limits your creative options when you believe that. But there are some people, there are a lot of Israelis. I have many, I was recruited to be the chairman of the American Friends of Combatants for Peace, which is an Israeli-Palestinian NGO made up of fighters. The Israelis are IDF veterans. The fighters are who serve time in jail as terrorists. But they have renounced violence and committed themselves to peaceful resolution of the peaceful search for a solution to their problem. I forgot what I was trying to say. You have to remind me.
Well, you were talking about the way in which
the book, yeah.
the book had affected.
You need to provide some kind of conceptual framework in writing. In this case, the book is, I was really blessed to be able to recruit, with a lot of help from outside academics, 7 very, very internationally respected scholars who dealt in very simple ways about on science and mathematics, for instance. The Muslim merchants going to India and coming back, and with Indian numerals which became Arabic numerals. And so they could give up these very cumbersome Roman numerals. Physicians, especially, were very intimate in their collaboration in Al-Andalus in Muslim Spain. And they set standards for pharmacists, and the philosophers loved to debate. They were debating all the time. They played chess together. You know, it's almost unimaginable, especially for European Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, whose experience is so traumatized, it's hard for them to think that was possible. One of the great tragedies of Israel, from again a psychopolitical point of view, is that the Jewish population of Israel is primarily Mizrahi now, that is from the east. Arab Jews from Morocco, the largest portion are from Morocco. But Egyptians, Persians, Turks, but they have been socialized by the European Jews who founded the state and established the myths. They were basically, especially through their experience in the compulsory service in the Israeli Defense Force, they have been trained to hate Arabs. The Arabs are the enemy, they want to kill us. And they have become the basis for the right-wing, far right-wing governments that Netanyahu has headed. And the so-called white tribes from North Tel Aviv, the Ashkenazi peaceniks, who are very interested in making friends with the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, if they can ever get down there, but have no interest in the Palestinian Arabs who are Israeli citizens. And that really makes the Palestinian Arabs angry. But the idea is to provide a conceptual framework for people to cite, to have evidence of how Arabs and Jews, Muslims and Jews, really had a creative community. And the Jewish, including Israeli historians who have studied this, have been I call it the golden age for jewelry.
Yeah.
In terms of scholarship, in terms of learning, of shared their own research, and their collaboration with other scholars and physicians and merchants, and so it exists, and it's there for use whenever. And this is the trouble with politics and diplomacy. You have to have a leader, and I don't want to use nasty words, but a leader has more imagination, and whose courage takes him or her to a point where they have the imagination to find ways or processes that can lead toward dialogue, towards negotiation, towards problem solving. Sadat was one of those.
Yeah.
Now, he was killed for that. Gandhi was one of those. Rabin was one of those, and he was assassinated. So, in a sense, those politicians who are adept at inciting fear and loathing on the part of a constituency are usually more common, and we see a lot of it in Europe now, in Hungary, in Poland, and parts of our own country. Although, alhamdulillah, which is praise be to God, the midterm elections brought a lot of young, determined women into the House of Representatives, including the first 2 Muslim women. I just saw a headline in Haaretz today. I didn't read the piece yet, but Haaretz is attacking the 2 Muslim women who were elected to Congress. The Saudis are. They have a lot of nerve to attack anybody.
Yeah. One other name, which you haven't mentioned so far, I think, which I always associate with you and the time I've known you personally, and that's John MacDonald.
Yeah.
You and he worked together, I think, in the FSI for a while.
Yes, we were in the Foreign Service Institute.
Was that an influence on you at all? Or did you?
Well, he is the most generous of my colleagues to credit me for bringing him into the circle. We were next door to each other in what was then the Center for the Study of Foreign Affairs, which was canceled by some jealous bureaucrats who thought we just should be, Foreign Service Institute should be doing teaching languages and computer skills. But John became enamored with the whole concept of Track 2, and he adapted it for his own work and did, and established his own institute. And I'm on his advisory board, and it was good. I bless everybody who endorses the whole idea of dialogue and problem solving like mature adults.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about, things that happened in the past and people who have influenced you and been influenced with you in the past. Spend a couple of minutes thinking about the future, because a couple of things you've said seem to me to indicate that maybe you take a slightly jaundiced view about what's going on in certain parts of the field at the moment. What do you think is going to be the outstanding features of the field, the way it's going at the moment?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious that I am very much tied to the idea of the psychodynamic, understanding the human mind, and how it's reflected in individual needs and group and tribal needs and national needs. And that while I encourage dialogue and problem solving, I discourage, for instance, or I'm discouraged by facilitators who, when people who represent strongly different views and who need help start showing some passion and some some emotion, will say, all right, let's stop now, because they don't know how to handle it. I've heard of meetings like that. The thing is, the field is very attractive to people who have the best motives in trying to be helpful in problem solving. But I think, you know, and I know our dean, Kevin Averick, has written about this too, about the importance of understanding of discipline, of analytical discipline, and understanding the dimensions. For me, it breaks my heart what's happened to ISPP now. The only thing that would attract me is to where they're having their annual meeting, if there's a place I'd like to go.
What happened to it? Why has it gone that way?
I think that the largest constituency of members are in the social sciences broadly defined. And if you're going to get a PhD, you have to do what your supervisors insist that you do. And so if you know, then you work for 30 years and get, or 20 years and get tenure. Then you can do something imaginative, but not before that. That's my impression from it. It's sad, but we have to just keep doing. I think that hopefully our session and the discussion of the parents of the field, once it's more broadly available, I don't know what your plans are, but ideally it should be made available. Hal's, I loved Hal. I've just seen one, but it was Hal's, and it was wonderful. What we're engaged in is the dilemma, the human dilemma of living and surviving and problem solving in ages that are more and more threatening, if not through nuclear war. I think we've been frightened enough about that concept, but in dealing with, for instance, environmental degradation, and that is really serious. I mean, it's going to flood coastal cities all around the world. Yet we have governments that, and our government anyway, or at least the outgoing Republicans, are committed to avoiding the truth about hydrocarbons. And it's a national tragedy. So we need mature approaches towards problem solving. And I see the mission of ESCAR is the mission of applying its skills, problem solving skills, domestically, internationally. And no problem is too small. When, in fact, the smaller problems probably are easier to solve. But that, and then, you know, one of my closest friends, I won't mention his name, but I had a discussion with him about the moral responsibility of academics in the social sciences. Problem solving, saving lives. And he just didn't buy it. That wasn't what the protocol was in his field. He's very gifted in his field. But there is an assumption in academia in general that, you know, we'll write the books, we'll do the research, and somebody in Congress or a governor or a mayor will apply what we've taught them if they read our books, which of course they won't unless they're forced to at the point of a gun sometimes. So I'm part of my work, part of my compulsion is to support candidates locally or for Virginia, for the House, the Assembly, for the Senate, and certainly for the Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. I believe that citizens who care should be putting their money to support good candidates so that their dependence on fat cats and dark money is minimalized.
But do you think it's partly our fault that there has grown up this, well, it seems to me two things. One is that there is this gap between what we as a field have become. We have become respectable academics,
Yeah.
and that means there's a gap between what we find out and how good or bad we are at conveying it. And I think I agree with you. I think we're pretty bad at conveying it. And the other thing is that we become this profession, which has become hierarchical and enclosed and has its own rules and processes which are internal to it, which have nothing whatsoever to do with the world out there, which was where we started. I mean, it seems to me that we started out as being people who wanted to change the world, and now we want to get tenure, and we want to get the next grant.
Yeah.
Is that too harsh, do you think?
Well, I don't know about the hierarchy. I find my colleagues, I don't have a faculty appointment, but working with Kevin and you and Dan Rothbart and Mark Gopin and Rick Rubenstein, I enjoy tremendously. I don't see any threat from them at all. But I gather that there's a certain amount of anxiety on their part about hierarchy. I haven't seen any evidence of hierarchy, but then I'm not part of the tribe. I work on the edge.
Yeah. Do you think it's an advantage to be working on the edge?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously,
I confess, I'm obsessive about my autonomy, and that's why I will forever be grateful to my supervisors in the Department of State, who allowed me to do my Track 2 work. At first, I would take vacation time, and I said, this is not right, because what I'm doing is trying to help advance the goals of American diplomacy, peacemaking. And they agreed. So I was never charged annual leave when I left. They could call it administrative leave. They knew what I was doing was of value. And so I'll bless them forever for letting me do what I was doing. I'll tell you one interesting story. When I used to speak to Jean Knudsen on the phone every day, the founder of the ISPP, or she would call me. And during the Iranian hostage crisis, she came to Washington. And I brought her up into the operations center in the State Department. And she got on the phone with the hostage takers in Tehran. She was absolutely fearless, and I think our team in the operations center didn't know really what to do, because they were supposed to be there. They were there 24 hours a day to see something useful happen. So they let her get on the phone, and she spoke to a hostage leader in Tehran. And got off the phone and said, I've got to go to Tehran. And I said, okay, we'll discuss how to do that. And that was on a Friday. On Saturday, I was called to a meeting with the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, David Newsom, who had been my ambassador in Libya, and we had a very good relationship. But he vetoed Jean Knudsen going to Tehran, which was, the discretion, the better part of valor. But that was the kind of energy that she brought to the ISPP, and when she died, it was just she was actually a target of some old men, academic men, who didn't like the way she acted, and that she was uncontrolled, and they wanted to control her. But I think just the survival of a big professional organization that needs dues-paying members, and where do they come from? There's a competitive, the American Psychological Association, American Political Science Association. They have subdivisions of political psychology, but political psychology has never, as far as I know, been really embraced at a level. I think I once tried to raise money for a meeting in Cairo at Dar al-Ifta, which was the Muslim Supreme Court. And it was to be psychologists and students of religion, or people, and including foreign students of religion and peacemaking and psychologists. I couldn't raise a penny. Nothing was more scary than Islam and psychology, and that was a number of years ago. I think I have a feeling that individuals who have impressed donors over a period of time establish a record, and they're more successful. But I think that there are only a limited number of donors. I mean, I've been blessed with this relationship with Carnegie for 20, 30 years, and with Steve Del Rosso. I think I mentioned that Steve commissioned a special article. They hired a brilliant journalist to do a cover story on Track to Diplomacy, and a very vivid cover and Steve had it blown up into a big poster for his room on saving, can Track to save us. So there's a real commitment there, and it's institutional, and they have a lot of money. But whoever applies for a grant has to be willing to take chances and be unconventional. My Civil War grant came after President Vartan Gregorian read a draft of my chapter, which is in the book that Dan Rothbart put together. And Steve Del Rosso sent it to him, and Steve tells me that Vartan, who I've met several times, was intrigued, and he said, we'll make this a special one-year grant in a special category. Because I made implications, drawing from unhealed wounds in the Civil War to the paralysis in the government. Norman Ornstein and Tom Mann wrote a book about It's Even Worse Than You Think.
Yes, I remember that.
So you have to be willing to be unconventional, and as I say, I am obsessive about my autonomy, which means I have a lot of personal debt, but I won't submit myself to the control of any person. I will deal respectfully with partners and build partnerships, but I won't, like Sam Lewis, our late, who was ambassador to Israel for 7 years and was appointed in the which administration? I think it was the Clinton administration, as chief of the policy planning staff in the State Department.
No.
And after a year, he told me that he quit, and I'm not going to join another organization where there's a hierarchy, and he has to be told what to do and not to do by somebody that he doesn't respect. Or he didn't put it that way, but that's what he was saying. That all of his work and energy barely gets the attention of the people who need it. So Then he became one of the first presidents and acting president of the U.S. Institute of Peace. But he was an independent person.
Right, look, last question, I guess, and that's what advice would you give to a young 25-year-old starting off in the State Department who wants to do something significant to bring some kind of peace and stability to some part of the world? What would you advise that person to do?
Well, I know a lot of my Foreign Service colleagues simply wouldn't recommend that they join the Foreign Service after what the current administration has done, whether it's under Rex Tillerson or even Pompeo. But I think there's an enormous amount of experience to be had in living abroad. Now, admittedly, many of our embassy compounds are like walled fortresses. And the work can be dangerous. But it's a tremendous way to get a sense of what we share in common with other religions and ethnic groups, and how consistent. For instance, I used to tell people that to the extent I have any manners, it's what I learned from my Iraqi friends. In fact, it was just absolutely heartbreaking to see what we did to Iraq. Depending on the circumstances, if we get a good president, a good Secretary of State that's smart and careful and thoughtful and interested in problem solving and also guided by values, human rights, Jimmy Carter came in and he was just obsessive about human rights. I had the chance to write Cyrus Vance's speech because one of my jobs in the Near East Bureau was to support the Central Treaty Organization, which was actually, and my job was to bury it also. But I wrote a very human rights laden speech text for Cyrus Vance. He made some changes, and I have it in my paper somewhere. So it's, we depend, what do you do with your passion? What do you do with your aspirations? I would certainly compete for entry into the Foreign Service and have some assignments, 2 or 3, and make a decision about whether this is whether this is a field for you. I recommend that if you can stay in for 20 years, at least you'll qualify for an annuity. And believe me, I have an annuity that I have until I die. And there aren't too many professions like that.
Not anymore.
Now, you are risking your life. The CIA has the same retirement plan. And of course, the military, you can get out before age 50, if you can make it to age 50. 20 years will do it. First of all, people have to decide whether they really are committed to public service, that they care about serving community, that they care about serving society and humanity. And then just survey the field and get the advice of people who are already working in areas that might attract you as a young person, and see what they say. Ask people what's hot now, where is there some, it may be an AID if AID survives this administration. Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State. I used to staff meetings with him. And he used to cite this Chinese saying, "This too shall pass." And I would say that no matter what your age, don't be so discouraged about what you're seeing. Try to get some advice from older people with some experience that you value, and take a chance on competing for an appointment. In some cases, people who are interested, for instance, the CIA Directorate of Intelligence is the academic side, is the analytical side.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to worry about going out and being a spy. And they could use more and more sophisticated levels of analysis. I have a lot of unattractive aphorisms, but what I want to say is that wherever we are politically, you have to take a reading and find people that can give you some respectable advice, and then take a chance. If your commitment is to serve other people, you'll find a way. It may be an NGO, although the NGOs are very careful not to take people who are right out of school, because they could get killed and their insurance rates go up. Mm. In other words, they'll want some people who have some experience abroad, and who have survived it well. But I have no simple answer, but I think individuals should examine themselves first. What is it that's important to me, to my life? How do I want to make a contribution? Why do I want to make a contribution? And what's the best way I can? And be flexible enough to move on from one opportunity or employment to another. I still strongly recommend getting a job where you can get a pension in 20 years. Because it gives you a lot more freedom to be independent.
Mm.
That's all I would say.
Okay. I think I kidded you. I have one more question for you, which is, turn the tables, and if you'd been sitting here interviewing Joe Monteville, what would be the question that you would have asked that I haven't asked?
Mm-hmm.
What should I have asked that I haven't?
Well, I don't mean to flatter you, but I think you've asked a very wide range of questions, and I can't think of something that you should have asked me.
Well then, Joe, let me say on behalf of the program, Parents of the Field, on behalf of ESCAR, and personally, thank you very much for your time and your memories and your wise advice, and we will certainly try to make sure that the interview and attached information will go out as soon as possible and be seen as widely as possible. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation.